Okay, the first thing I did when I was setting up the system was I put out a sprite for every Into the World as a pickup for every weapon that there would be. So I made a pickup for the lance, the sword, and the wand, and I got a polygon collider on here, and I checked that make sure it's a trigger, and then I took that same sprite with the collider, and I made a weapon inventory game object, which is just you create an empty and then you name it weapon inventory, and then I parented a corresponding weapon of each type underneath the weapon inventory, and I positioned it in the hand of the player graphic. Right, so you can see there's the lance and the sword and the magic wand, and then this wooden sword is the sword that he starts with. There's not one out in the world already for him to pick up, so he starts with a weapon. And each of these pickup weapons has a script or a playmaker FSM that you can see right here. So we have this initialize state, and the first things it does is it goes and it finds its corresponding weapon in the inventory. So since this is the lance, it goes looking for the weapon inventory right here. I'm sorry, so yeah, it finds the weapon inventory because it needs to know where the weapon inventory is. And then here in the listen event, it's basically just it's waiting for the player to collide with this trigger, right? So it's the trigger 2D event. And it's on trigger 2D enter, collide tag is the player, send event player pickup. And you see I have this player pickup event added right here. Go to add to inventory. And now this is where things get a little bit tricky, is where I'm using this set FSM game object action. And I have these set up in what's a sequence. So if you see this little line here that separates the first action from the second action, there's a little arrow pointing down. So if I go ahead and turn that off, so like that's the default state right there. If I click this little gear up here, there's this thing that says action sequence. I'm going to check that. And the action sequence ensures that each action in this list occurs this first, this second. If this isn't an action sequence, this can theoretically occur before this, and that's where things could get buggy for us. So I set that to an action sequence, and this set FSM game object is basically, it's looking for an FSM on another game object, and it wants to set the game object variable type. So I'm looking for the weapon inventory, and I'm looking for an FSM with the name weapon inventory manager, or weapon inventory management FSM, and the variable that I want to set the value on is the weapon to add, and the value I want to set it to is the player lance. So what that's going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select the weapon inventory right here. I'm going to click over to the variables, and I'm going to select the weapon to add. So if you look right here on the weapon to add, the value is currently set to none. Now I'm going to go up here, get back in the game. I'm going to go up here and I'm going to collide with the lance. And you see as I did that, the lance state machine set the value on weapon to add to the player lance. So it found this lance here, and then it added that into the inventory management system. So after it finds the lance to add, it sends this event. And the event it sends is called add new weapon. So once again, it's looking for a game object FSM. We're specifying the game object, and the game object is the weapon inventory. So we want to send an event to this weapon inventory, and the name, and the event is add new weapon. So if I go to weapon inventory here, you see there's this event right here, right? You see how start is this black box with an arrow pointing down, and add new weapon has that same structure. So this graphic means it's a global event. So if I'm sitting here, like, okay, so I'm going to watch the weapon inventory as I play through this, right? So this FSM is sitting in listen, and there's no transition out of listen to assigned to weapon array, right? So when I run over a weapon, this event, add new weapon, gets called and it goes back down to listen, and it just waits. Every time I do that, because all these weapons have the same state machine, it gets called here. And to make one of these events here, because you can't just right click add transition or make a new transition, you got to go over here to this events right here, and I'll just call this new global event. Press enter, and then you check this box, and now the event is global. It can be put on any state. I'll go ahead and delete that because it's not going to serve a purpose. All right, so we should talk about the weapon inventory manager now. So the Lance, basically it finds the weapon inventory, it waits for a collision, then it sets a variable on the weapon inventory and sends an event, and then after that it disables itself. So it basically just turns itself off. I'm not destroying it, I'm just turning it off. There's no need to destroy it. Destroying objects can basically invoke something called the garbage collector, which is the scripting platform that Unity is built on. It's form of memory management. So instead of having to manage memory yourself, there's a little program that does it. It's kind of the best way to think about it, that handles cleaning up things that get left behind it. It's best to just not have to deal with that. So instead of destroying the object, we just deactivate it. So I'll show you that here real fast before we move on to the weapon. So if I go over here and I walk over the Lance, you see in my scene, it's all still there. They're still there, they're just disabled. I mean, from the player's perspective, they don't exist anymore, but in the game's mind, they're still there. All right. And each of these weapons has an identical state machine, just they're set to basically they're all finding the weapon inventory, but they're adding a different weapon to the inventory. So if you notice, like, we're not actually finding the weapons that are in the inventory on these objects. I chose instead to do that on the weapon inventory because I'm not using tags on the weapons, and I wanted them to get found really easy. So on the initialized state of the weapon inventory, I'm using the find child action, and there's a find child for every single weapon, including the wooden sword. So while there's 3 weapons in the world, I've got 4 file child actions that each find an item by name. But since it's find child, it's not searching the entire scene. It's only going to look at, like, okay, I'm going to look at the children of weapon inventory, and as soon as I find what I'm looking for, I'm going to save that into a variable. Now, these variables are a little bit different, and if you remember, like, looking at the Lance here, there's no player Lance being assigned anywhere in here, right? The only game object that's being assigned is this weapon inventory. So what I did to kind of get around having to find the player Lance from the Lance is I use something called a global variable. And if I'm over here on the variables tab, and you can see right here there's this globals tab, or a little global section. So we've got a player wooden sword, a player lance, player magic sword, player magic wand, and then something called equipable weapons. So a global variable is a variable that can be seen by any other game object in the game. It doesn't have to be declared on every FSM. So that's really powerful and very handy, but it can also be bad because since everything can see it, everything can write to it. So you need to be very careful about what you allow to write to a global variable. So that's what I do here with this find child is I go ahead and I should show you how to make a global variable. So I'll go ahead and do that real fast. We'll just make another game object. We'll say this is for a demon sword. We'll keep it in line with the other one. So player demon sword, press enter, and if I right click on it with it highlighted here, I hit move to global variables and it says, are you sure? Say okay, and it goes. So now it should be, it's gone from this list, but it's not showing up here because it's not being used. But if I go up here to Playmaker, editor windows, global variables, I get a list of all my global variables, and there's my player demon sword. And of course I can also, from this this window here, I can make new, just make a global time variable, right? And it keeps adding them into this here. So these are all global variables. I'm going to go ahead and delete global time and global demon sword. You need to be very careful about using global variables, but it's kind of a learning process. If you use them, you're inevitably going to probably screw yourself over at some point, but it's a good lesson. It's a good thing to go through. Then after I find all these guys, right? So if you see on my player, in my scene, they're all active. Now, here's a funny thing, is like you can't actually find a game object and store it in a variable unless it's active. So I am waiting, I'm finding everything, and then after they're found, I then go through and I deactivate all the things that aren't the default weapon. So basically all the other weapons. And I also, on my array, which is the equipable weapons, so I'm going to be saving all of my equipable weapons to one of those array variables, right? So I'll show you how I made this one. Array, we'll call this equipable range weapons. All right, so I went ahead and I made that, and the array type is currently float. I'm going to change that to game object. And then I also made this a global variable because I didn't want to have to go through and find it. And there's only one player, so it seemed like a good candidate for a global. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, right click it, and move it to globals. And back on the weapon inventory, go to the state. Okay. So basically from my equipable weapons, I then wanted to add the value of the player wooden sword. So what essentially that does is that adds the wooden sword to the inventory, which is this action over here on this assign to new weapon. That's the only thing that gets called, and actually that doesn't need to be an action sequence, but it is. It's not a big deal. So that's the only thing that gets called, and that value, remember that weapon to add value gets set by each individual weapon. So this is how we add them into our array. Then it hangs out to listen. Oh, I'm going to remove that. That was a failed attempt to make this a little bit simpler. So that's how the weapons all get added into the inventory. I'll go over equipping them in the next video. So I'm going to just go through here, and I want to we'll go over the actual FSMs on the weapons to make them do their things in another video. But I want to get one last chance here for you to get a chance to look at the weapon inventory management FSM, right? So I'm going to go ahead and make this as big as we can so you can pause the video and study the state and the action sequence. So it's just basically, it goes through and it finds the player version of every weapon, not the world version, right? So these are the world versions, these are the player versions. This goes in, it finds the player versions, and then it deactivates them, and then it adds the default weapon. We have a global transition, right? If you're confused, be sure to look that up in the Playmaker documentation. It's a global transition with the action of array add, and it's adding a variable called the weapon to add, which is a variable that we made here. and those all both of these states transition into a listen state. We'll go ahead and we'll look at the weapon again. On its initialized state, we're looking for the weapon inventory, which is this right here. We're not looking for it by tag, and we store it in a variable, a game object variable called weapon inventory. If I select that and I hit play, you watch this down here, the value, see it goes in and it says value weapon inventory. So it found the weapon inventory. All right, in the listen state, we have a single action, which is the trigger 2D event. It's looking, the trigger's on trigger 2D enter. And remember, the collider for these, for the lance and the sword and all that, we have to check that trigger box. The collide tags the player. It sends the event, player pickup, meaning the player's triggered the event, and we're going to move over to here. And this is the tricky part about this, is we're using the set FSM game object action. I'm specifying a game object. I've got this little button here, hit for using a variable for the weapon inventory, right, which is this guy right here. And I'm looking for the weapon inventory management FSM, and the variable is the weapon to add. So you will need to set up, before you do these actions on this state, you're going to need to set up your weapon inventory, right? So it doesn't make sense to set this up on your lance and your sword and your wand, right, up to this add to inventory action, until you've gone into your weapon inventory and you've set this up. Okay, and so then once we've set the variable that we want to trigger, we have to send the event to then assign it to the array. So this is where we do that send event, where we're sending once again to the weapon inventory manager FSM, and I just use copy and paste to set these. So this right here, weapon inventory management FSM, that's the name. You can highlight that text, copy it with Control C or Command C, I mean, and then just paste it, right? Because if this isn't spelled correctly, it won't find it and it won't work. That's something that I've never not had students struggle with that. So I'm expecting you guys to mess that up. And then the event that it sends is this global event. Remember, that check mark is like you can make an event down here in the event, add event, and then check the box, and then you add the event that has the checkbox. So add new weapon. And if we look on our weapon inventory, yep, there it is. There's our add new weapon event. That it goes from listen to jumps to over here, and we have the array add action. All right. I know this is a lot, and we're just getting started here, but take your time, go slow. If you need to draw these things out on paper and take notes, do it. Whatever it takes to get this done, do it. Okay, pull out all the stops. Next video, we're gonna go over actually switching the weapons, and that's a little bit more difficult.